All right, so welcome everyone to Practical Canker Management in Almonds and Prunes. My name is Luke Milliron. I'm a farm advisor for orchard crops with Cooperative Extension in the North Sac Valley, Butte, Glen, and Tehama. And this webinar is sponsored by the support group of Butte County UCCE that paid for the webinar license. And thanks to Franz, who applied for the DPR and made this meeting free for everyone. So just a roadmap of where we're headed. We are online, so we're in the welcome and introduction. I've introduced myself. I'll be handling the technical support here in the background. So if you have technical problems, please drop them in the chat. Franz Niederholzer, my farm advisor colleague in Colusa, Sutter, Yuba counties. He is going to be our moderator. Then we're going to have Themis Michailides talking about prune canker management, and Flo talking about almond canker management.
Our first speaker is Dr. Themis Michailides, Themis is a UC Davis plant pathologist stationed at the Kearney Ag Center, and he's going to talk about prune canker management. And thank you very much.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. This morning, I'm going to talk on the management of prune canker diseases. And I think I will introduce a new concept for this, the control of these diseases, as you'll see at the end of this talk. The main player for this research the talk is based on is Dr. Yong Luo. Franz Niederholzer helped a great deal on this, and also my staff research associate, Victor Cabri. And before going to the talk, I would like to give you a definition of what a canker is. And according to official definition, canker is a symptom of an injury, often associated with an open wound that gets infected by a fungal or a bacterial pathogen. And you can see in this picture some cankers, different shapes, different margins of cankers. Some have a sap. They can be formed in different types of shapes. And here in cross-section, we can see the affected woody tissues by the cankers. Over the years, we have done surveys, and our research was based mainly on Cytospora, but when we collect samples to isolate Cytospora or samples that farm advisors and growers send, we not only isolate Cytospora, but also up to 8 different fungi that can cause cankers, and also the bacterium, one bacterium that can cause the bacterial canker. And you can see that all these names of these fungi have been reported in causing cankers, not only in prunes, but also in other trees. But among these, the most damaging, I would say, is the bacterial canker, Ceratocystis canker, and Cytospora. And from these 3, I would say, I'll put Cytospora number 1. Bacterial canker may be close to Cytospora number 2, and Ceratocystis number 3. Very briefly, I'll cover bacterial canker and also Ceratocystis, and then I'll spend more time on the Cytospora. The bacterial canker, as the name indicates, caused by a bacterium, which is the Pseudomonas syringae. And this bacterium can infect trunks and branches of shoots of prunes. Can have 2 phases, can produce the cankers and also the blast, causing killing of young shoots and also flowers of prune and other prune species. You can see here on your left a canker that is within the characteristic amber color sap. And this canker is in contrast to the almond canker here in the cross section. To the right, you can see that the margins of these cankers are not very well defined, and develops these pockets of brown tissue that eventually get a kind of a cinnamon color. So the bacterium is called an epiphyte because it lives on the surface of the plants, and it is usually associated with cold temperatures. Research, although this bacterium has been studied a lot, still this disease is poorly understood. And from experience, we know that prunes that are grafted on peach rootstocks show less disease. And also the disease is more severe in sandy soils, and it was shown that the ring nematode can stress the trees, and that's why we need to fumigate in order to reduce the nematodes and alleviate the bacterial canker. Also, it was shown that if we do high trunk budding, that also reduces the bacterial canker, although the actual reason why that happens is not well known. And also practices that promote the vigor of the tree will be a method to reduce the disease. Late pruning to avoid the spring rains. I know you do that, and that also is not documented by experiments, but a lot of you do late pruning, and this is mainly to avoid wet conditions and reduce bacterial canker. In other states or cytosporas in other trees and other prunus trees, they show a reduction of the bacterial canker with copper sprays. In California, this was not shown to be beneficial. And to say more with less, I would say that combination of several practices may help mitigate this bacterial canker disease. The ceratocystis canker has another name also, mallet wound canker, because it attacks the wounds that the old method of harvesting by knocking almonds or prunes with mallets created a lot of wounds, and the fungus Ceratocystis fibrillata, which is the cause of this disease, enters through those wounds and creates cankers. The cankers of ceratocystis usually have a diamond color, as you can see here on the left, and has more or less defined margins. And general information about this is that the pathogen overwinters in old infections and is associated with the insect vectors like nididulid beetles, Drosophila flies, and other insects. The fungus also prefers shaker wounds or wounds from harvesters and other agricultural equipment that create wounds. Pruning wounds can be affected, but not so often. Also, twigs that break, etc., occasionally are infected, and also sunburn tissues can be a site for infection by this pathogen. To control this disease, major attention should be given to the shakers, not to harm the bark of the trunks of the trees. And in fact, the irrigation specialists recommend that the irrigation should stop before harvest at the right time in order not to have a slippery bark and create these wounds. By reducing the shaker wounds, you can reduce infections at the trunk of the trees that will be detrimental to the trees. And also, number two here, this is not something unusual. but prune when rain is least likely to occur. So cankers that limbs that were killed by this canker should be removed because they can be the sites for overwintering the pathogen. And when you remove these cankers, they should be pruned 6 inches below the external margin of the canker, because the fungus is in the wood and will progress from there. This the cankers, cankers also, if the cankers are smaller, you can do a kind of a surgically clean the canker, but usually with the first attempt, you cannot remove the pathogen. It is can be eradicated if you do a second surgery in the same canker. And also, it was shown that white paint to avoid sunburn can help, as well as the right pruning to have enough shade of the trunk. These are all practices that can help in reducing the ceratocystis canker. But the major disease that I would like to spend more time for the management of this disease is Cytospora canker. The old names are Cytospora leucostoma, Cytospora cincta. Flo has done an excellent study in checking all the cytosporas from prunus and from other trees, and now the fungus has a new name, but in order to avoid confusion, I'm using the old name, Cytospora leucostoma, Cytospora cincta. You can see that Cytospora can kill branches and scaffolds of trees, mature trees. The cankers can develop sap, as you can see here on the right of this slide. And this also includes Botryopsera here, because sometimes from cankers from prunes, you can get also the Botryopseriaceae fungi, as you show you the survey. And these both pathogens have very wide host range. Cytospora can infect all the prune species. The same also with Botryopsera, but Cytospora also can infect nut crops, palm fruit, and a large number of forest trees. The symptoms on the left, you have the Cytospora canker that is very distinct margins, creating dead tissues versus the healthy, very distinct margins. And usually on these cankers, you will see these bumps, which will be the pycnidia of the fungus, the structure that produce the spores. In contrast to the bacterial canker, which is to the right of this slide, where the margins of the canker are not very distinct. You have these pockets, and also you have a distinct fermentation smell when you remove the bark from these cankers. So the Cytospora infects pruning wounds. That's the major site for infection, especially in young trees, but also you can find infections when you do hedging and topping. You can get infections when you do the grafting and the graft union there, and also if you have wounds from hail. We isolated Cytosporum for this type of wounds, which indicates that the wounding the tissues is a good site for infection by Cytospora. Here's a close-up of Cytospora pycnidia. Of course, Botryopsera can do the same, but here, characteristically for Cytospora, you will have this white development on the openings of this pycnidia. And this is very characteristic for the Cytospora fungus. If you remove the bark, you'll see that the pycnidia are solitary here developing. And a lot of, when you have Botryopsera cankers, the pycnidia will be in groups, not solitary as shown here. That's a diagnostic feature. This pycnidia, here's a section of the pycnidia. You can see it's almost like a gelatinous matrix. All the spores are in there. When it gets rain, those will be exuded from the pycnidia. And you can see the strings here hanging from the pycnidia. The rain will splash, disperse them. When they dry, then they can break and they can spread also with the wind. This is the conidia, the spores of the fungus from the pycnidia. We call them pycnidia spores. And also this fungus produces the perithecia, but at least in prunes, we never found the perithecia, which develop the ascospores. Here is an ascus with 8 ascospores, and these become airborne and can spread by air. But the main means of spreading the fungus is the water. Which are the common infections for infection sites, and what predisposition factors for cytospora? First of all, if you have killed bark by any means, even including bacterial canker, this can be colonized with the cytospora. And sometimes when we get samples, we isolate both the bacterial, the Pseudomonas syringae, the cause of the bacterial canker, as well as the cytospora. If you have injured bark by freeze or sunburn, those are sites where cytospora will develop. The pruning wounds is a major entrance point for infection, or wounds from breaking branches. Also damage by insects, cankers caused by the brown rot fungus, Morellina laxa, hail injuries, and also any mechanical wound can be a site for infection. So once the fungus is established in these dead tissues or the weakened tissues, then the cytospora pathogen can invade and progress into healthy tissues to create a major canker, dieback, and shoot, killing and branches, and also scaffolds. So to summarize here, the life cycle, the inoculum can be on the scale of these killed branches and scaffolds. The pycnidia spores will splash dispersed, as you can see here. We'll have the exudation of the oozing of the pycnidia spores, and they can affect young trees. When you have the canopy making the major scaffold, you have pruning wounds. The pruning wounds can be infected, and we also can have pruning wounds in mature trees. All this can be infected and can lead to killing of additional branches and scaffolds. But again, the ascospores here can play a role in other states with cytospora in cherries, for instance, but in prunes, at least, we don't have it. So we want to, in order to develop management approaches, we wanted to learn a little more about the infection of pruning wounds and the infection of prune by cytospora. So we did this experiment in which, and this is an orchard in Yuba City, we depend only on the natural infections. We did an experiment, we pruned this in the winter. Actually, France did all this pruning. And thank you very much, France, for helping on this project. And then some of these were wrapped with parafilm to exclude the inoculum, the splashing spores. And some were not wrapped, they were exposed to the abundance of inoculum. Rains occurring that year. And then months later, we recorded, well, a few months later, we started recording the cytospora. Now, you can see here that we have the ones that were not wrapped with any plastic. They got levels of infection from 80 to 100%. And this is from the external inoculum, the spores that were splashed. But to our surprise, those wounds that were covered with the parafilm, we got about 10 to 20% infection, which tells us this had inoculum already present there. And we call this internal inoculum or latent infections, infections that remain dormant and they wait for the right conditions to develop. And the right conditions here was making the cut, the wound. Now, this is in agreement with what goes in nature. We know that stress trees get cytospora, severe cytospora. You have stress trees from water stress, you have freeze damage, sunburn. Always cytospora will be there to attack those tissues. Potassium deficiency, insect damage, or oil phytotoxicity. Here's an example where in these pictures, all these shoots were damaged by oil application. And very soon, June 3rd, the entire shoots were covered with pycnidia of this fungus. So the fungus is there, present, and then the stress develop, the kill tissues, and the fungus develop right away. For the external inoculum, it's easy to, to measure that because we can collect, as we did here with rainwater, in 3 orchards. We collect, France collected these bowls, we analyze them periodically, and you can see from the graphs that in all 3 orchards, the green bar is the cytospora. We can detect high levels of spores of cytospora. In addition, although this picture shows almonds, this was done for both almonds and prunes. We can detect also other fungi in the Botrytis like Botrytis dophilia, Lasiodiplodia, and Fusicopo, which tell us that these spores spread with the rain, and this is the external inoculum, which is water splashed. Now, this is the model we developed regarding the infection. We have 2 mechanisms of infection of prune. We have the external inoculum that, the main site of infection for the external inoculum with the wound, but also stress trees. If you get the external inoculum, they can develop cankers. And then we have the internal inoculum or latent infection, or some people call it endophytic stage. And for this internal inoculum, the major site for infection or condition is the stress tree, the stress tissues. But also if you have wounds, internal inoculum can activate it, as we show with the wounds that we wrap with plastic, and canker can develop. Now, how can we use this information to manage this cytospora canker in prunes? First of all, we want to protect from external and internal inoculum. We did this experiment here where we created 2 wounds on these trees, and we apply various fungicides, as you can see here. The rates that are recommended in the label. And the pruning was done in November, early December. The fungicide application was done 1 day later, and we included 10 to 14 wounds per treatment. These are the results for 3 years. You can see there is some effect of various fungicides in comparison with the control, but something that really stuck in our mind was that Topsin consistently for 3 years gave us the least amount of infection of the pruning wounds, with exception in 1 year, the Quilt XL gave us the smallest infection rate. And thus we included that in the following experiment as well. So to protect the trees from external and internal inoculum, we did another experiment here in which in a prune orchard up in Yuba City. And of course, the fungicide of choice was Topsin. We also included the Quilt XL to repeat this. And we included Captain and lime sulfur that we know in other states they use to control cytospora on peach to see if they will have any effect on the untreated control. These were 3 replications of 30 trees each in 2 commercial orchards. So the cankers, the trees were evaluated in March, and they were sprayed in March. And you can see the blue bars here show the trees that were evaluated before the treatment, okay? This is in orchard A, which has more disease, and in orchard B, less disease. And the treatments were applied the treatments applied 25th of March after evaluation of the trees. This is the untreated control, and this is the other trees that were sprayed with these fungicides. You can see in both cases, we were able to reduce the incidence of cankers. As you can see, the untreated control also has a reduction, natural reduction. The cankers healed or did not develop any further and did not have an effect of the signs were disappeared. But definitely here you can see that these were very significant from the initial time of recording the trees. The same effect was in the other orchard. Significant reductions with all the chemicals, and Topsin again was a good captain, was very effective in this one here. So we claim that this is a way now to think about this disease. Even when you don't have symptoms or you have some cankers, at least you can apply an early spray in March and you can maintain the incidence of the cankers development to low levels. Oops. Okay. So spraying the trunk and the crotch of young trees seems to make a big difference. And this is something new. I think we plant young trees in the orchard. We wait until we start spraying for foliar and fruit diseases. But it's almost like I consider this like a vaccinating the trees, protecting the trees from this external and internal inoculum that exists in those young trees. So this is supported also with experiments that we've done with almonds against a Botrytis canker disease, the band canker of almonds. These are almonds in the second leaf that were sprayed, the trunks and the main scaffolds here. They were sprayed with Topsin and one treatment with Topsin and Raleigh, 3 applications of 50 trees each. Here are the results. The results show that one spray in March reduced the incidence of the cankers. It prevented the cankers to develop in the treated trees in comparison with the untreated trees, the blue bars here. So this supports what I'm saying, that the spraying, these sprays that are done prophylactically to protect the tissues from infections, internal and external inoculum, seem to be very effective. We went back, this was done, recorded 8 months later, and we see this major difference. 15 months later, we still have major differences. And then we went to almost more longer than 2.5 years, and we still were losing trees in the untreated controls. 3 trees were dead, and no trees died in the treated treatments. We also have evidence that this internal inoculum occurs in budwood. And we took budwood from 2 nurseries. And this is done to help the nurses. I know some nurses became very upset with some of these results, but we find this fungi. Here we analyze budwood from nursery A and nursery B. We analyze the buds and also the shoots, and you can see the cytospore is present along with the other canker pathogens. You see Phomopsis here very high, Lacerdiplodia, Lacerdiplodia. So it is present. And so I'm not sure if the nurseries treat the budwood, but what we did when we treat the budwood by dipping it in Topsin or Topsin and Maribone, we could reduce the disease significantly. And this is something that we like to continue with this and help the nurseries to provide not only clean trees, but also to use, to have treatments for the budwood and to reduce these canker diseases. So in conclusion, and this would have been reported previously, but now makes sense why we prune diseased branches in late winter when it is dry. This is, of course, to reduce the external inoculum because you remove a lot of branches with inoculum present. When you remove infected trees, the stumps also can be removed because the stumps, the bark will be covered with pycnidia, and also that measure reduces external inoculum. Avoiding piling the removed trees or the prunings next to the orchard is a practice that should be continued. You have to avoid this because that will be another source of inoculum. And also this will have insects that can carry spores of the fungus. Again, by avoiding doing this, you reduce external inoculum. And now avoid tree stress and injuries to the bark and the stems. This and also applying a topsin immediately after pruning. This protects these trees from both the internal and the external inoculum. And now the new findings are like this. We got to these conclusions, and in addition to the treatments in the nursery, okay, this is important for the nurseries to provide young trees. I know some nurseries do treatments to provide clean trees, but can be this process should continue in the field. As soon as you plant the trees, they need to be protected before you see any cankers. But even when we see cankers, again, we showed that a spray in the spring reduces the development of the cankers. But if you protect them before you see the symptoms, you will be very good and delaying the disease to develop in the orchards. We know, and this is not something new, really. We do the traditional practice to control foliar and fruit diseases. When do we apply the fungicides? We apply them before we see any symptoms to protect the tissues from infections. The same thing should be applied here to control the canker disease. We need to protect these tissues from this inoculum that can be external if we have rains, or can be internal if the trees have some inoculum. They're not so clean. But even when we have symptoms, as I showed you in the young trees, a spray with topsin, at least we know that we can protect the trees, the additional trees to become sick and develop cankers. And with this, I would like to close and thank the California Prune Board for the grant, for funding, CDFA, the pest exclusion branch, the advisory board for improvement of this branch that help us for the funding. Also the prune growers that provide the orchards. And I show the contacts here, my telephone number. And thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Themis. We're a few minutes behind schedule, so I'm going to have Franz move us along in just a second here. Just a couple quick notes. Of course, there's a lot of mention of pesticides today in this hour and a half. Mention of a pesticide does not constitute a pesticide recommendation. Always read the label. The label is law, and consult your PCA. And then finally, just on a technical note, I saw that someone asked a question in the chat. Please place your questions in the Q&A. If you place it in the chat, it'll just get buried. So if you have any questions throughout, either for Themis to start answering around 10:10 this morning, or for Flo up next, please place those in the Q&A. All right.
Thank you very much, Luke. And thank you, Themis, for very important information. Our next speaker is Dr. Florent Trouillas. Dr. Trouillas is an associate professor in the plant pathology department at UC Davis, stationed down at Kearney. all set. Thank you, Flo.
All right. Thank you, Franz, for this introduction. Can you see my screen and hear me well? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. All right. So this will be a follow-up talk, more focus on almond canker disease. There's a lot of similar information that will be presented, but for the almond tree crops. And there will also be, of course, complementary observations and research from almond work. So with this, just like Themis presented, there's a lot of commonalities between canker disease of prunes or almonds, but in general, what we call a canker is this discoloration of the wood. The discoloration may be irregular or V-shaped, wedge shapes. A lot of these canker diseases are generally associated with profuse gumming on the trees, and this may be occurring at pruning wounds or at cracks on the trees. But in general, with almond, cankers are the leading cause of tree death. They can cause dieback and eventually kill entire trees. So a serious problem in almonds that needs to be properly managed. First, also through my talk, I will share a lot of pictures. There's one point that is very important and that I often repeat here is the importance of accurate diagnostic before any management. It's very important to understand what disease we are dealing with. Themis showed that as well, a lot of confusion, a lot of gumming on these trees, so oftentimes occurring at the same site like pruning cuts. And so because of all these overlapping symptoms, there's generally a lot of confusion, and eventually, the wrong management strategy may be adopted when the wrong diagnostic is made at first. So throughout my talk, I will provide tips here through images on how to be able to improve your field diagnostic with this canker disease. So through my talk, I'm gonna focus mainly on the fungal canker disease. I will talk a little bit of Phytophthora, but I won't get into bacterial canker. Themis touched on it. There's not really much difference for almond, but mainly I'm gonna focus on Ceratocystis canker, the Botrytis or band canker, Eutypa and Cytospora. I'll have a few words about Phytophthora, silverleaf, and foamy canker. So I think by now, after several years working with cankers in California and with the collaboration of many farm advisors, I probably have visited about 140 orchards in California. And there is no doubt that Ceratocystis canker remain the most prevalent canker disease for almond. Band canker, but is also a significant problem, especially in young orchards. And also lately in recent years, we definitely have seen an increase with Phytophthora cankers. Many orchards throughout California from south to north also suffer Phytophthora cankers. And more sporadically, we would find Cytospora canker or things like Eutypa canker as well in almonds. So similarly, and before we get into any management strategy, it's very important for us to understand the diversity of pathogens that are associated with each of these diseases. When we test the fungicide, when we test a management practice, it's very important that we make sure any fungicide, for example, would work against the broad diversity of fungal canker pathogen associated with this disease. So for band canker, for example, or the Botrytis canker, we have about 10 to 12 species involved in this disease complex. For Ceratocystis, it's pretty much straightforward, one species. Same with Eutypa canker. However, with Cytospora or Phytophthora, we have multiple species that may be implicated into causing this canker disease. So I will start first providing information about Ceratocystis canker. Again, I mentioned it's the most common canker disease of almond. Anywhere a tree will suffer a shaker injury from the harvester, you will most likely have the development of this canker with amber gumballs starting from or initiating from the shaker injuries. So very classic, very common in orchard and most likely to occur whenever you get shaker injury. The pathogen is called Ceratocystis cambriata. Again, it's a fungal pathogens, and it can pretty much attack any trees, any age, anywhere there is shaker injury, from young trees, definitely mature tree as well. You will see this sort of darker black water-soaked, almost looking like lesions developing from the injury. And generally, you will see gumball occurring in the margins of the areal margins of the canker. When infection occur at the shaker injury, eventually the infection may make its way up into the main scaffold branches and kill entire scaffold, eventually entire trees. What's very important to keep in mind with Ceratocystis canker, it's also that pathogen may also infect at pruning wounds or mechanical injury. And I believe this is when specifically the confusion comes in terms of, confusing that disease with Botrytis farreia or Phytophthora canker. But ceratocystis also definitely can prevail at pruning wounds. Here are really typical symptoms. That was just for a recent visit of orchard. You have a pruning cut in the center. But what's very typical about ceratocystis canker is the occurrence of gumming mainly at the margin of the infection and not throughout the infection like you would see with Phytophthora. More rarely, but you can find this also, is infection of ceratocystis canker at thinning cuts. In that case, the disease eventually could be confused with something like verticillium right there on this picture. But looking inside the canopy, you will be able to see the gumming occurring at the pruning cut infection and this typical diamond shape canker typical of ceratocystis. I've been on several calls in the past few years where ceratocystis was absolutely severe and damaging to orchard. We had infection up to 20-30% of the tree. And from experience, I've noticed that this high level of infection from ceratocystis occurred when pruning was done early in the season, meaning like in September or between September and November. That's a period where you would be tempted to do pruning, but because there is no rain usually during that time of the year in California. However, it seems that those early pruning are really highly susceptible to ceratocystis canker, and that may be due to the activity of the vector for this disease, which are sap-feeding beetle and fruit flies. Basically, when a bark is injured, some white mycelial fan will form below the broken bark, and fruiting bodies typical of ceratocystis with this long neck and a droplet of spores at the end will be forming, which are then picked up by this insect and moved to fresh wounds, fresh pruning wounds, or fresh shaker injury. So something very different here. Ceratocystis canker, in comparison to the other fungal canker disease, is not distributed by rain, splash, or water or wind, but mainly by insects. So management of ceratocystis canker, I'll get into more detail later talking about a fungicide, but obviously you want to avoid any shaker injury and follow up your workers and make sure they're not shaking those trees too hard. When canker has developed on the tree, there is sort of an old way to cure the infection using this old tool. The idea is to remove the infection at the end with about going at least half an inch deep inside the wood to sort of curate that area, remove the infection, and with the hope that the tree will heal behind. Topsin also has been a good product for protection of these wounds, and I will talk in a bit more detail about this later. Band canker or Botrytis farreia canker is also an important canker disease of almond. It's very typical by the fact that the gumming pattern will occur generally at cracks. And these gum balls will develop like along the circumference on the trees, and in severe infection, you may see multiple bands going up the trees. Again, a disease associated with young trees. You don't see the problem generally after the trees are 5 or 6 years old, but it can be common in trees with really excessive receiving excessive amount of water or nitrogen, where the growth is really fast, leading to the cracking, and so new sites for infections. Band canker is definitely favored in area where you have the sprinkler or micro sprinkler wetting the trunk of the trees. Damage can really be really impressive from the outside. However, oftentimes trees may recover from band canker, and if you look at internal discoloration, you can see that sometimes canker can be contained. The tree can sort of heal out of the cankers and survive in the following years. Band canker, just like ceratocystis, also may be found on trunks, but also very commonly at pruning wounds, and we'll talk later more about this, what the importance, of course, of protecting pruning wounds from infection. Cytospora canker is more rare in almond, but we have found it several times here. And the difference with the other cankers are very elongated. You can see this black dark discoloration, very elongating up the scaffold branching, less gumming, obviously, than the others one, but still occurring at pruning wounds and developing this elongated canker. Cytospora Themis also have presented the prune work, very severe in prune, probably one of the the first limiting factor for prune production, really active canker in many stone fruit, but including prune as well as cherry. And what's important with Cytospora is anywhere stone fruit will be infected, particularly prunes or cherry, you will have numerous fruiting bodies and spore being produced on the dead wood. So something to keep in mind, and the importance of removing the dead wood from orchard in those stone fruit blocks. Eutypa, also a very common canker disease for grapes or apricots, but we can find it in almonds. It also developed at pruning wound, and that's a canker that we will find more commonly from Merced and up into the Sacramento Valley. It's not a disease that we will find down south, Fresno, Kern County, and so on. What's very typical with Eutypa canker is we usually also find it at cracks at the tree crotch from like poor scaffold selections and cracking. Here's really classic example of Eutypa canker. You have a crack forming at the junction of the main scaffold branches, and little bits here and there of those shiny gumballs here, really a typical example for Eutypa canker. So for field diagnostic, I mentioned the importance of having an accurate diagnostic. There are ways to distinguish the disease. At first, maybe overwhelming. What we see is a lot of gumming, but you will notice that in general for band canker, the gumballs occurs at cracks and develop along the circumference of the tree. I mentioned Eutypa canker, cracks at the junctions of main scaffold, little gumming. And a good way also to separate Phytophthora cankers from Ceratocystis canker is Phytophthora canker will produce gumming throughout the infection area, whereas with Ceratocystis canker, the gumming is generally associated with shaker, but you will see gumballs occurring at the margin of the infection mainly. Nevertheless, what all these diseases have in common is all can infect at pruning cuts. And so these are usually the cuts made for primary and secondary scaffold selection. So that tells us that it's going to be very important here in our management to protect all these large cuts that are made during the building of the structure of the tree and primary and secondary scaffold selection. Here is sort of a summary of the main cultural practice that may lead to infection. I just mentioned scaffold selection, as illustrated in this picture, may leave large cuts on the tree, so this will need to be protected. Harvest, shaker injury on the trunk will be an entry site only for Ceratocystis. We don't see other species associated with shaker injury or the canker disease. And again, this maintenance pruning, when large branches are removed on the trees, this can, of course, be also, again, new entry site for this canker pathogen. So really large pruning cuts on the tree, young trees for scaffold selection or maintenance are going to be the sites that needs to be protected. We don't see really much canker disease developing from an edging or topping of almonds, so those are not really main issue, but definitely pruning cuts will need to be protected. General biology, basically, Themis touched on that with Cytospora canker, but a lot of these fungi can produce fruiting structure on the dead wood of any host that could be ornamental, forestries, or any other stone fruit. So when rain occurs and fresh pruning wounds are present in the orchard, spores are released from that dead wood and can contaminate a fresh pruning cut. Here are illustration again of Cytospora, a pile of dead stone fruits next to any orchard. Cytospora will produce tons of these tiny little fruiting bodies. And then again, those are source of spore, source of inoculum, and source of contamination for orchards. This is an illustration of how any of these single fruiting body can produce basically billions of spore. So that's tell us that it's very critical to protect pruning wood, and of course make sure to get rid of all the standing dead wood next to orchard, and particularly those young prune orchards. So again, I mentioned that all these diseases have in common or a lot of infection at side pruning cuts made for scaffold selection. There is no curative option for canker disease. Once the fungus has made its way inside the wood, there's pretty much no way to kill it. So our efforts here are going to be preventive to protect the pruning wounds. Prunings in California, traditionally, maybe, trees that are trained to 3-4 scaffolds. So this will leave a large number of pruning cuts. If you are in Australia or maybe Spain, you may have less pruning and have sort of trees that are untrained. So you may have a lot less pruning wounds. But in a typical situation of California, at scaffold selection, a lot of wounds will be made on trees, and so this will be very important to protect this pruning cut. Here are illustration of the cuts following scaffold selections. You may see growers attempting to put a paint on these wounds, but basically a lot of wounds are left that will need to be protected. And the idea basically here is to prevent the establishment of these fungal canker pathogens in the early stage of the tree development, because if infections occur now at this young stage, it's more likely that the tree will die. So a lot of cost to replace trees and eventually replant orchards. So in the past years, we've done a lot of field trials here in California to test various products for pruning wound protection. We pretty much looked at everything that's registered for almond. We looked at this mixed fungicide premixture. We looked at single frag molecules, but we also look at biocontrol agents, biofungicides such as the oils. We looked also at sealant and paints. And we looked to protect those pruning wounds against a broad diversity of pathogens. That's the idea. There are many species out there that can cause disease. So in our trial, we make sure to include the diversity of pathogens or disease that can affect almonds for pruning wound protection. Quickly, it became very obvious, similar to Themis finding in the prunes, that Topsin was a great product to protect pruning wound. In this trial specifically, we had 0 infections following protection of pruning wounds with thiophanate methyl Topsin, whereas we had significant disease in the non-treated. I think this slide here summarized a lot of our finding over the years. The longest, the bar and the best efficacy. Topsin is always definitely on the top, providing up to 80-90% of disease control. But we were also very excited to find a trichoderma, which is a natural biocontrol agent with the product Vintec that also offer great efficacy at protecting pruning wounds. Things like Quit XL and Rime had a sort of a moderate effect for protection. But if you look down there, things like acrylic paint really did not help much, with only a sort of a 20% efficacy for reducing infection when compared to a control. So numerous products, Topsin really exciting. Vintec also, this biocontrol really exciting. I'm going to talk a bit more about it. This is just last year trials here at Kearney. In those trials, we spray the fungicide either with a water bottle or a water spray bottle or a backpack sprayer. And then we inoculate those various fungal pathogens. So we're working under really high disease pressure conditions. And if you look at these results here, where the non-treated control here is in orange and the Topsin treatment is in blue, looking at a control against Botrytis varia pathogens, we pretty much have up to 90% to 100% disease control against some of these pathogens, as well as against ceratocystis. So great effect here again for Topsin. Here are, I believe, pictures that tell the whole story here. You see an unprotected pruning wounds with the gumming and the infection developing. and you see a pruning wound that was protected with thiophanate methyl. In the case of a ceratocystis infection, we had no disease. Similarly, here, after the bark was removed, you can see an unprotected pruning wound receiving the ceratocystis canker infection and the typical diamond-shaped canker, and the same pruning wound that was protected with Topsin, no disease at all. We looked a lot at trichoderma product. We were enthusiastic to also provide alternative solutions. The two chemicals, or trichoderma is just another fungal species that act as a mycoparasite or a competitor of the canker pathogens. And the advantage eventually working with this non-toxic product like trichoderma is, whereas a chemical will just stay right there at the surface of the pruning cut after application, the trichoderma is able to colonize the wound and provide a long-term control of long-term protection of a pruning cut and of the wound. I mentioned again, Vintech performed as well as our Topsin product, so very exciting for us to find a biocontrol that can work as great as a chemical. We find also ways to improve the efficacy of a trichoderma. In our case, was to mix the Vintech product with sticker spreader. In our case here, New Film P. We can see when that product is mixed with the sticker spreader, the efficacy is even better, and again equal to that of Topsin in terms of reducing the risk of infection of pruning wounds. So the next question was, how do we apply this fungicide? In particular, how do we apply those trichoderma in field situation, field trial situation? We're often using those water spray bottle, and we're aware that those are far from something that's applicable in the real world. But we tested eventually, solo backpack sprayers, those manual sprayer, when we would only target to apply the product with the pruning at the pruning cut specifically. So with really low volume per acres, really targeting the pruning cuts. We work with friends also to test brush spot electric sprayer, where you can afford to have larger quantity of a product. And so we have to think, is it realistic, and either for Topsin or even a trichoderma, to use this smaller equipment to really only target the pruning cut and have volumes such as maybe 15 gallons per acre or so. But the real question was, can we apply any of these Topsin or trichoderma product with more conventional sprayers? So last year we ran these trials here at Kearney, the collaboration of Dr. Jim Adoskevich and his staff. So we basically, again, created the cut, spray with a more conventional sprayer, and then inoculate and look at disease control. What we saw is not the control, like there's an illustration for control of Butyrispharia canker. Control is not as great as if we were to apply with more of a manual electric sprayer, but we did also get under really high disease pressure, again, get decent control and protection of the pruning wound using our trichoderma product. Is the amount of disease, 100% of pruning wound infected in our non-treated control, and a significant reduction of infection using the conventional sprayer. With Topsin, still results are discussable. There is reduction of disease, but it's not perfect. We worked at rate of 30 gallons per acre and 100 gallons per acre with the fan turn on and the fan turn off. The question is now, should we move at a really lower speed, provide maybe a 200 gallons per acre to provide a better coverage, and maybe a coverage until runoff on this pruning wound. So this is continuing research. There's hope that definitely conventional sprayer also will do the job. So yeah, I just mentioned that the importance with using any smaller equipment is you can just work to only target those pruning cuts and not worrying about providing a full coverage of the entire tree canopy. Here is what we worked with France, brush pot electric sprayer, and that worked great. We had about almost 90% disease control with this sort of equipment in the orchard. So the big question right now is where we are continuing research using a conventional sprayer, maybe at larger volume, and we're testing again fan on and fan off. We're working to lower the speed, eventually close nozzle to really target the trunks. and see where we can go with following up research on that. Here are a few slides from Themis. I know he touched on that in his talk, but regarding specifically the management of bent canker, the idea that Themis developed there was to sort of have these sort of cleanup sprays in the spring of the trunk or parts of the trees, with the idea of reducing both the internal inoculum that he mentioned, those sort of latent incubation of the pathogen, as well as potential external contamination coming from fruiting bodies outside of the orchards and infecting fresh pruning wounds. So Themis launched this research with a single spray in the spring and looking at the development of bent canker in the orchard. And I think he shared very similar slides. But what Themis observed is like these cleanup sprays, one application on young trees starting at second leaf with topsin was able to significantly reduce the development of bent canker in this young almond orchard. And those results showed years after years, that disease management was significantly improved with cleanup sprays. I want to touch a few words on rime. A lot of you may have heard from FMC that rime has a systemic activity and can help in the management of canker disease. So we wanted to take this concept and test it ourselves here at Kearney. So we chemigated through the drip irrigation system rime at about 7 fluid ounces per acre, and that rime is then sort of dropped around the tree base through the irrigation system, in our case micro sprinklers. And the idea is that the product will be picked up from the roots, moved systemically up the trees, and provide controls eventually of ongoing infections, or reduce the severity of ongoing infection. So we had actually last year tested the product through chemigation against both ceratocystis and Botrytis canker, again, the two most common canker diseases here in California. What we saw is, although the product is not, in that case, preventive or curative of any infection, the result that we had last year showed that actually the product through chemigation can slow down an ongoing infection or slow down the development of lesion. So this is work to be continuous. In our case here, we had 2 to 4 applications of rime through the drips, and you can see here lesions, for example, in a non-treated control for ceratocystis canker were about 50 millimeter, whereas they were almost reduced by half with the use of rime. So something to look further, and something eventually exciting here and to be followed up. We also look at rime residue to confirm that the product was moving systemically through the trees. What we submitted shoot and kernel samples. It was very interesting to see that the product is not moving that much into the kernel, which is very exciting. So less emerald, less residue for the fruit, but a significant amount actually, again, detected in the shoot. So some interesting finding, and that we are looking to explore further in continuing field trials. A few words, I'm not sure how much time do I have, but about the management of canker disease is the big question is when to prune. I mentioned that we may all be tempted to prune early, September, October, November, when there is no rain. However, we by experience shown that this early pruning leads to eventually severe infection from ceratocystis canker, which again move with insects. So if pruning cuts are not protected during early pruning, we may have a significant infection with ceratocystis canker. But we look pretty much at all modes of pruning for things like Eutypa, the Botrytis, the Cytospora. And what we see in general, that slide summarizes it all very well, is that a pruning wounds will remain susceptible for about 2 weeks, but then after 2 weeks, the susceptibility of a pruning wound will decline significantly. Pruning late January, early February, here in that case, we observed that pruning wound was susceptible for barely just 1 week. Okay, so late pruning with the application of a single application of something like topsin or a trichoderma will significantly reduce the risk of infection. Scaffold selection, when we prune trees, it's very important to keep in mind that allow a good attachment of the scaffold branches by allowing a 45-degree angle to separate between the main scaffold as well as horizontal spacing. Avoid cracking. Basically, that's what I'm saying here. Appropriate scaffold selection is very important to not having so many cracks developing at the junctions, and of course avoiding wetting trunks and so on. In summary, for the management of this canker disease, it's really important to prevent disease establishment in the early years, protect those wounds that are made near the trunk. Remember that the pruning sealant, sealers, or acrylic paint do not provide a great controls, and you're better off working with your conventional thiophanate methyltopsin M. Exciting result for Rhyme, where we show it can move systematically. It's not curative, but it can reduce or slow down the infection. We have great biocontrol agent, the trichoderma product Vintect. Obviously, do not prune during rainy weather. Remove all this dead wood and dead stumps around the orchards, and avoid wetting the trunk with sprinkler. Remedial surgery, if you have an infection, you may want to remove the infection. In that case, you will want to prune a couple inches below any discoloration. Appropriate tree training and scaffold selection is very important. And again, delayed or late pruning will reduce the duration of pruning wound susceptibility. Themis has shown those cleanup sprays in the spring, also very important to clean up the trees for internal and external inoculum for band canker management. Not sure how much time do I have, but I have other things. If I have to stop here, I'll stop there.
Yeah, we're several minutes over, so if we can keep moving. Thank you both so much. Those were excellent presentations.
Thanks very much, Luke. First question. Can the topsin be applied in the fall after pruning and still have good effect on infection? Themis or Flo?
I think yes, it works. It works. There's no reason it doesn't work as good in the fall than in the winter. We generally do our trial in the spring or late winter, but there's no reason topsin should not work following September or October pruning.
In our trial, the fall application and the spring application were very similar.
Okay. Is as a follow-up, does it matter that the fungicide's applied right after pruning or in front of the rain, or as long as it's applied before rain, is that adequate, or does it must go on right after pruning?
I'll say word for almond. We have to keep in mind in almond that some of those most serious canker diseases are not sprayed by rain, and that's the case of ceratocystis canker, right? So, I mean, the safest option it definitely is to spray immediately after pruning and not wait, because again, ceratocystis canker moving around with infect could get to the pruning wounds at any time after pruning.
So we applied the fungicides 1 day later, which was and it was very effective with topsin again. But the sooner you can get into applying the fungicide, the better it will be, because in that way, at least in prunes and also in almonds, you don't allow the latent infections to be activated and work their way to start the infection.
Okay, thanks very much. For my next question, should we be dipping pruning shears in fungicides during the pruning in the young trees in the nursery, or just spray afterwards?
Well, this will not be very practical, but the ideal thing is to disinfect the pruning shears. But if you have a lot of cytospora in prune orchards, you can do that. But the best practical way would be to apply and try to avoid to prune, 2 to 6 inches below the cankers. So.
We have tested the transmission of pathogens or through pruning, if we cut through a canker and back to a clean wood, you generally do not transmit the disease. But if you were to cut through fresh fruiting bodies or those fruiting bodies that we show and then back to clean wood, in that case, you can transfer the infection. So, but in general, cutting through a canker or just wood, there's little risk to transmit the disease.
Yeah, if you prune through a branch that has pycnidia, at least for Butchersphere, we show that you can transfer it to the clean, healthy shoots to 2 to 3 healthy shoots after you cut through a pycnidia area.
And at the same time, I don't think Maravon have a registration for pruning wound treatment for treating the cuttings. Could you use bleach or more importantly alcohol as a to sterilize your shears without effectively use it?
Yeah, well, bleach or is it Lysol registered?
I know most fire blight cutting, they use alcohol. Luke, I see you want to jump in there.
No,
Oh,
I just don't think
Oh.
Lysol is registered.
okay.
Some people may do it, but I don't
Yeah,
think that's registered.
To my knowledge, the material of choice is the alcohol. You don't get the damage to the steel that you get with bleach. Anyhow, thank you very much for the information. What about shredding prunings? Is that a Themis? I think Flo 2 both talked about moving the cuttings out of the orchard and burning them. What about risk of disease infection by shredding?
Well, Mohamed Nouri, working with walnut, has shown that shredding for disease like phomopsis or can actually be factor of spores release, right? So in almond shredding small wood, I would not be maybe too worried. There's not so many fruiting bodies, but eventually shredding those wood with the many fruiting bodies of Cytospora also can be other way for spore dispersal. So if you see abundant fruiting bodies, like it's very obvious, for example, for phomopsis in walnut or Cytospora in prunes, if you have the fruiting bodies, then shredding may just be another way of dispersing the spores.
Okay, and another.
In pistachios, we show the Butchersphere pycnidia can last for 1.5 years in prunings that were even buried under the 1 inch of soil. So some of these fungi are persistent, and the best way is to remove the inoculum away from the trees.
Thank you both. There was an associated question. What about spreading inoculum in the smoke from burn piles that are near orchards?
In the smoke.
It's very unlikely.
Very unlikely, I will say. Yeah.
So shredding is much more important, or pardon me, burning and getting them out of the orchards, much more a factor, improving the health than much. It's more important than burning as far as keeping them clean. Question, is it common to have multiple infections at the same canker? Multiple pathogens infecting the same.
Oh yeah, I mean you can have Cytospora Butchersphere. You can find it and also Butchersphere phomopsis. In fact, in walnut, for instance, it's very common to have both in the same shoot. But when we isolate for Cytospora, we can get various canker pathogens. But one will dominate, and perhaps the others are secondary, because all these fungi, they like the tissues also. They behave like saprophytic fungi also.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah. And
go ahead, Flo.
For almond, where we have these very characteristic symptoms, let's say for band canker or ceratocystis, in general, we mainly isolate the most important pathogen, right? Meaning either ceratocystis fimbriata or one of the Butchersphere species in the case of band canker.
Thank you.
Great. It is 10:30, and I have pasted that that link in the chat for folks who need DPR credit. You have 1 week to fill out that survey and get at least 70%. You can take it multiple times. I'll also be checking your attendance and see whether you were here for the 90 minutes or how much credit you deserve. But yes, back to the Q&A if our experts are willing to stay on.
Next question up is, can you comment on if you think about whole orchard recycling presenting a risk as an inoculum source for young orchards, and would a fallow period between chipping and spreading and new planting ease that risk a bit?
I think for almond, eventually we would have some consideration if you may have a lot of armillaria into an orchard, because those are, any wood pieces larger than 1 inch are good inoculum sources for further infection with armillaria. But for, from the moment that all these wood pieces are reincorporated into the soil, I'm not too concerned that, further Botrytis or ceratocystis will spread, knowing that once they are incorporated in the soil, there will be a lot of natural competitors, contaminants that will start, degrading those little fruiting structures. So I'm not too concerned about the whole orchard recycling for further infection with these fungal canker pathogens of almonds.
Excellent.
I would say that perhaps the larger pieces, if they don't incorporate, they're on the surface, they can provide some inoculum. But if the majority of the pieces are in the soil, they will degrade. Yeah.
Yeah. And my understanding is that Roger Duncan put in a armillaria, kind of rootstock survival trial in the last few years. And as part of that, got cut up discs or chips of previously armillaria infected trees to kind of inoculate. And my understanding is that the pathogen did a very poor job of actually surviving that process. I think Themis is right, especially once it's chipped up and incorporated and exposed to all the other microorganisms in the soil. A lot of these plant pathogens, at least so far, have not done a good job of surviving. We haven't documented increased disease risk with whole orchard recycling, at least to date.
If you leave large pieces, scaffolds, etc., with cytospora, for instance, in the surface, and you plant young trees, and you have a storm, definitely you have some, and then you have pruning and storm, and definitely you have a splash in inoculum coming from those, since the canopy of the young tree is much lower and can be splashed easily from the ground.
Thank you. Thanks both. And Luke too. Next question: when will Vintech, the trichoderma product, be available for prunes?
So for prune, I'm not sure. Daisy's working on getting data, right? So that could be in the process, but I'm not sure there are a specific effort to register it for prune though.
And
it is registered.
yeah, and again, so Vintech is registered for almond flow.
Yeah.
Okay, and so Vintech, so one of these trichoderma materials, Themis has not found efficacy for cytospora in prune with trichoderma. However, the Rizzo lab at UC Davis has found efficacy for not for canker disease, but for wood rot. So why prune trees at the end of their lives typically are turned into balsa wood and don't have much orchard to even think about recycling is because of wood rot. And they have found some evidence for trichoderma helping with that, but I think that we're still potentially years away from them being able to get that registered.
Yeah, we have looked at Vintech in cherry against Eutypa and cytospora, and it's working also really good.
And Flo, these are all inoculations or natural infection?
Those are inoculated. The pathogens is artificially inoculated. Yes.
Yeah, our trial was under natural infection.
I
And
believe.
go ahead, Franz.
So thanks, Luke. I believe the Trichoderma vintech has been exempt from tolerance by the EPA. It's fairly very safe, so safe they don't have a tolerance for it. So I hope that registration would come along, but for prunes, but we'll have to see.
And one other consideration when we see these slides saying Topsin M is effective and Topsin M is labeled, you can use it for prunes and for almonds for pruning wound protection. But you should, and then also Trichoderma works in prunes for wood rot. It works in almonds for canker diseases. However, you should not tank mix these two, the Topsin M and a Trichoderma material. The Topsin M will kill the Trichoderma. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I have a question about the details of evaluating pruning wounds. Let's come back to that. Have you tried any plant defense inducers in any trial?
No.
Yeah.
We haven't.
Let's see.
What is the background behind that question? I mean,
I don't know, but they could potentially post in the chat or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question, thoughts on the use of Coumadin in almonds for canker. And I know Coumadin doesn't have a section 3 label yet. I believe it's had a section 18 for a couple of years. But how do you, so Coumadin in almonds for canker, how do you think the extreme frost would affect young trees and vulnerability to canker this season with the very cold temperatures we had in February?
Well, Coumadin is a bactericide, right? So it will target only the bacterial canker disease by Pseudomonas. And so it's under section 18 right now. He has shown great efficacy from the work of Dr. Jim Adoskevich, but generally it's applied those couple days or week before the frost events during bloom to have maximum efficacy. It's not shown to have a great effect against a canker per se, but for the blast disease of the Pseudomonas blast disease, it's highly efficacious based on the work of Dr. Jim Adoskevich.
Sure. Some of the canker diseases and infecting almond trees through frost injury damage, is that a possibility? I'll state it again, sorry. Can these canker diseases infect almond trees through frost injury?
Well, in theory, but in almond, I'm not sure I've seen frost injury causing like really large cracks. It's maybe not that bad or rarely enough in almonds to be of a concern, I would say.
Same with
the
prunes, yeah.
Botrys furiaceae can infect frost injured tissues. So it's very, any damaged tissue from herbicide, sunburn, things like that.
Yeah, and Themis, you've done a really fabulous job documenting that with all of these freeze damage events we've had in walnut. We've had several in the last few years, and if you have dead wood, if you have any kind of dead wood dieback from a freeze in walnut, that wood is going to be colonized by Botrys furiaceae sooner rather than later if you don't cut it out.
Thank you. Is acrylic paint the same as latex? And I think could latex paint be used to seal pruning wounds? I know it's been addressed. But
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. We had that question before, and originally we were a little confused. But latex acrylic paint is the same thing, and it doesn't provide much control for pruning wound protection, at least in almond, against canker pathogens.
Yeah, years ago we tried to control to protect almond trees with latex, and we didn't have any control.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I often hear growers and PCAs talk about the correlation between Krimsk 86 rootstock and band canker in almonds, as I'm assuming, as the rootstock is the reason, as if the rootstock is the reason for the infection. Can you touch on if there is any direct correlation or cause to this?
If the rootstock, it's one of the vigorous, isn't it? Vigorous rootstocks that probably creates growth cracks.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the like a chain event. If you have a vigorous rootstock that imposes vigor on the scion, then you have growth cracks, and the botrytis will infect those growth cracks.
Okay. So it's the cracking, not the specific rootstock.
It's the effect of the vigorous rootstock.
Okay. All right. Thank you. For bacterial canker, are there management recommendations beyond addressing tree vigor and nematodes? And how often does cultivar selection affect susceptibility?
Well, anything that will improve the vigor of the tree. The work of Roger Duncan showed that low barrier rates nitrogen applications could, invigor the tree and reduce the risk for in the following years expression of the canker disease. So, but other than improving the tree general health with proper fertilization or nutrition, there's really no much chemicals that can help reducing the canker.
Well, for prunes, choosing a peach rootstock seems to help.
Is there any link of bacterial canker with almond rootstocks that have some plum in them, like Krimsk or Rupak R, or has that been looked at?
I'm not sure.
Let's come back to that. Any recommendations for getting access to those who can help identify the type of canker present in the orchard?
Well, contact your farm advisor for any support, and the farm advisor can either deal with Themis or I for confirmation. But by experience now, I think a lot of these canker disease even can be diagnosed based on even with pictures, I would say, because some of these are really characteristic symptoms, and so sometimes just a picture will do.
Okay, thank you.
If one pays attention to the details of the description of the cankers and the signs they see in the field, I think it can be easily diagnosed. Of course, we are plant pathologists and we're talking like this. All the other people have to know all the other things in addition to.
Just for maybe comment here, we have also developed specific molecular primers, and those have been made available also to private diagnostic labs. So whenever there is a doubt, there's also molecular tools now that can help, narrowing down or precisely identifying those canker diseases.
Thank you. For prunes, do we need to be applying topsin after mechanically topping? We tend to top right after harvest, but prune in January, February.
I think the application in the fall is fine, because we show in an experiment that reduce the incidence of the cankers. And in fact, we saw a lot of cankers up in the pruning trial in Glenn County, where these cankers from the topping and hedging were infected, and in fact not only with Cytospora but also with other Botrytis or canker fungi.
Thank you, Themis.
Although so definitely, I think there's, Flo can jump in here, I think there's less evidence for hedging topping being a real source of infection. But I would say in both crops, and what you will find on your DPR quiz here, in both crops, it's those primary scaffold, secondary scaffold selections when you're establishing the orchard. Those are the highest risk, because you have an infection that goes into a primary scaffold, your tree's toast. Secondary scaffold, maybe you have a chance to prune it out. So those are the highest risk, because it's just so much closer to the trunk.
But what I see also with other stone fruits, maybe prune and cherries, usually when you do a topping with these crops, topping is much more severe than what you would do in almond. In almond, you may just sort of trim and remove like those younger shoot. But with cherry or prune, you know, there are some topping operation that seriously like remove like large branches, open the tree also to sunburn, and so that creates another pressure for things like Cytospora canker. In almond, usually you trim your edge, you're not getting rid of major, like, you know, you're not like drastically topping these trees and tapping into large woods. So in almond, I never really seen any issues from this, but with prune or cherry, I would be careful with topping.
In prunes, you know, the topping, when you expose those wounds, you also get the Neoscytalidium. Also, I saw it in cherries also, because as you said, the sunburn stresses those tissues and they're getting easily infected by this pathogen that is almost specific to sunburn tissues, the Neoscytalidium dimitiatum.
So it's important, very important to treat after hedging, especially in prunes.
I think
and
so.
cherries.
In
Okay.
fact, the hedging and the topping create wounds that are not a clean cut. And in the literature, they show that shredded wounds are more susceptible than a clean cut infection, wound infection.
Right. Thank you, Themis, and Flo too. Last question, are the diseases more prevalent in northern or southern areas of the California valleys?
Well, so some temperature factor or humidity factor may selection some specific disease. For example, for Eutypa is common in the Sacramento Valley, but we never found it south of Merced, right? There are some Botryopsferia that may favor really warm temperature and maybe be more common in some warmer region for specific species. But for almond, I guess Ceratocystis canker is definitely ubiquitous. I would say, you know, band canker also pretty much can be found anywhere. But I think it will be more specifically for things like Eutypa that require a certain amount of rain for the fruiting bodies to develop in the wood. So you know, other than Eutypa, most of these other diseases will be quite ubiquitous.
Well, for Cytospora, I would say, yeah, the Northern California is more common, but when you have cherries and down in Bakersfield, and they had severe cases with Cytospora as well. So the pathogens can be all over, but depending on the weather conditions, the disease shows more frequently and in high intensity in the Northern California because of the rain. There's more rain there.
Thank you. There's a question, a couple more questions. There's one, it sounds like careful pruning and wrapping, I think along the lines of what Themis was showing, could reduce pesticide applications. You showed the parafilm wrapping.
Yes, you can reduce the infection, but still we get 10 to 20% infected.
Thank you. Final question. This is sort of follow up on the question you had a minute ago on Themis with the hedging pesticides spraying after hedging. So would 2 applications of topsom be more effective? One after the topping in the fall and one after pruning in the spring?
In our trial, the 2-in-1 spray were similar. There were not a significant difference.
Okay. If you're making more cut
More what?
in the winter, if you're two times.
These are 2 separate pruning events, then you want to protect at each time, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've covered all the questions asked.